los servicios espaciales de la Unión Internacional de Telecomunicaciones. También coordina el proyecto de Space Explorer de la UIT para mejorar el acceso a los datos de los servidores espaciales. Presta asistencia y apoyo a los miembros de la UIT y participa activamente en seminarios y conferencias mundiales de radiocomunicaciones. Es coordinadora de la VR para la iniciativa Network of Women for WRC 23 y se incorporó a la UIT en 1999 para trabajar en el examen reglamentario y técnico de las solicitudes de redes satelitales. Hoy, Veronique nos presenta aspectos reglamentarios de las actividades en el espacio intraterrestre en relación con los reglamentos de la UIT. Veronique, muchas gracias. Dejo el micrófono para ti.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for the introduction and giving me the floor to speak about the regulatory aspects of outer space activities in connection with ITU regulations. We will start today by looking at the importance of the regulations of the radio spectrum and the associated orbits. Before introducing the ITU and the role of the radio regulations, then I will present you the main steps to submit satellite network filing to ITU before ending with the trends and challenges of these regulations. So why do we need regulations for the radio frequency spectrum and the orbits? When they have a project in space, entrepreneurs think they will have no limits. However, satellites must communicate with the Earth and use the radio spectrum from an orbital position. This is too limited natural resources. They must be shared efficiently among all the needs of various radio services. So from broadcasting to the broadband internet to radio astronomy or Earth observation. As frequencies and orbits are used globally on the planet, beam directions can affect the operation of other antennas and create multiple risks of interference during operations of services. That is a law of physics. So while we know that in space, it is better to anticipate the risks. So now let us look at 3 specificities of activities in space today to understand how the radio regulations answer the question to ensure operation free from signal interference. First, space has a global impact. A treaty ratified by governments brings international recognition and stability. Secondly, space is not really big enough for all activities forever. There is a need to maximize the possibility of use. So a solution, the radio regulation propose a process for allocating and coordinating the 2 natural resources, so the spectrum and associated orbits. It is interesting to note that these 2 natural resources have particularity, unlike water or air. When they are not being used, they are not degraded by the previous use, so they can be reused infinitely. And finally, space is risky for investment. It is reassuring to have before operations the possibility to resolving the risk of signal interference and getting international recognition through the ITU frequency registration. So the radio regulations provide a solution for operating a signal free from interference. And indeed, space is large enough for all operations only through effective cooperation and elaborate international regulations. So how do the ITU and the radio regulations work? So what about ITU? So the International Telecommunication Union is the United Nations specialized agency for ICTs. With the ITU, the radio communication sector, called ITUR, is responsible for the allocation of frequency bands to radio services and for the proper functioning of procedures, plans, and operational measures. All this while respecting the principles for spectrum and orbits utilization. So the ITUR brings together delegates from member states, private sectors, and academia. And the ITU instruments are its constitution, convention, and the International Evolutive Treaty, the radio regulations, together with its rules of procedures and recommendations issued by the ITUR. At the headquarters in Geneva, here in Switzerland, so the staff of Radio Communication Bureau provides the secretariats for the ITUR sector and the radio regulations. In the basic text, so the ITU constitution, there is 2 articles which are really fundamental. It's the Article 1, which states that ITU shall effect allocation of bands and the radio frequency spectrum, the allotment of radio frequencies and the registration of radio frequency assignments, and for space services of any associated orbital positions in the GSO and any associated characteristic of satellites in other orbits. All that in order to avoid harmful interference between radio stations and of different countries. And there's also the Article 44, which is interesting. It states that member states should endeavor to limit the number of frequencies and the spectrum used to the minimum essential to provide in a satisfactory manner the necessary service. And that limited natural resources must be used rationally, efficiently, and economically so that countries may have equitable access to those orbits and frequencies. These fundamentals lay the foundations for a sustainable approach of space at ITU. Now, formally, the radio regulations is 4 red books, edited in the 6 official UN languages, so French, English, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, and Chinese. The spectrum is regulated from 8.3 kilohertz to 3,000 gigahertz, which cover all the radio spectrum. It covers also services, terrestrial services, but also maritime services, space radio services, and radio astronomy. For the space services, the associated orbits used can be the well-known geostationary, but also the non-geostationary, including LEO, MEO, HEO, and other celestial bodies like the Moon, Mars, or deep space missions. So we know now that the non-GSO orbiting the Earth has become increasingly populated since 2015. Now that today's version of the radio regulation is the result of amendment of 40 treaty conferences since 1906. It's an evolutive treaty. It is an intergovernmental treaty. Decisions are made only by consensus, which is extremely important because that means there's no votes. And without votes, it is giving the treaty a higher level of application. It defines the rights and obligations of member states with a balance in between the two. And it is a combination of technical and regulatory mechanisms to coordinate satellite network projects before the launch in space. So recording satellite networks in the Master International Frequency Register provides international recognitions of operation free of signal interference, which is the final goal. As we've seen, the goal of the radio regulations is to ensure efficient and equitable sharing of spectrum and orbits. However, the space environment is constantly evolving with new technologies to be combined with existing ones. So the mechanism for decision-making is the World Radio Communication Conferences, which are the conclusion of technical preparation by the ITUR study groups during the 4 years between 2 conferences. It's a cycle of work. This period of time is long enough to ensure full compatibility and short enough to allow for new activities in space. The mechanism is also inclusive. All stakeholders can participate together in the study of the agenda items. So member states and members of private sector and academia are studying the agenda item and the modification amendment to the radio regulations. So consequently, the result is a stable amendment to the radio regulations, decided by consensus by the ITU member states. And the ITU member state has 193. Within the UN outer space environment, ITU is listed under other agreements in the outer space treaties. So it is interesting to recall that telecommunication issues as transmissions in outer space are under the responsibility of the ITU. This is also recalled when appropriate in the agenda of the COPUOS sessions in Vienna. So we saw the need of a regulation and how to create it. Now, how is it applied through the procedures to file a satellite network at ITU? We'll see the main steps of this process, starting with the national regulator. The national regulatory authorities, called administrations, submit to the ITU the satellite networks filings. Then the staff of the ITU Radio Communication Bureau process the filings in accordance with radio regulations, doing compatibility analysis of the beam's characteristic with existing systems. So the national administration are also issuing licenses to use the spectrums on their territories. So the licenses are not issued at international level by ITU. Now, to control interference, the radio regulations have 5 mechanisms. The first mechanism is frequency allocation, which allows the separation of different services. There are currently 40 different services. And secondly, the power limits, which protect terrestrial and space services by calculating PFD, ARP, and EPFD. So it's a signal transmissions. The third one is the coordination. It is when operations are in the same portion of the spectrum and the previous limits are respected, the PFD limits. The coordination mechanism between operators eliminates any risk of interference. So once the first 3 mechanisms are completed, the fourth mechanism is the registration in the Master International Frequency Register, which provides international recognition of right to use the submitted spectrum and orbit for the satellite network in question. Then the international monitoring system is the last mechanism to ensure control of interference once the satellite is in operation. So now let's look at the steps of what we call filing at ITU. To prepare a submission to the ITU, the first step is to identify the service area on Earth and its corresponding ITU region or regions, as well as the radio service and the optimal frequency band to be used. With these 3 information and type of network, GSO or non-GSO network, you can refer to the table of frequency allocations to identify the provisions and processes to follow in the radio regulations. So here on this slide, you can see the paper version of the table, and ITU developed a tool to navigate automatically from provision to another one electronically. Then there are 2 main approaches, called in our jargon coordination non-planned approach or the space plans approach. So on the left side, you can see the coordination approach. It's on a first-come, first-served basis, but as public parking can be full on popular sections of the orbit, and the coordination process more difficult or almost not impossible for new satellite projects. On the right side of this image, you can see the a priori space plans. It constitutes reserved access to a GSO location for future use by all ITU member states. So the right to use the almost equivalent of a private space slot is acquired through a planning process at a World Radio Communication Conference. This plan approach gives priority to equitable access to space only in part of the BSS and FSS bands. It is similar to a semi-private parking. It does not optimize the use of the GSO when member states do not use their reserved slots, so they remain empty. So coming back on the process of filing for non-planned notices at ITU, it consists of two main phases. So the coordination phase, in which the Bureau examines the notice of satellites network submitted in accordance with the radio regulations and publishes the results of the coordination requirements with other previous submitted networks. Then, after the phase of negotiation and adjustment of the parameters of the satellite project to eliminate the risk of interference, it is a notification phase. The Bureau checks the final characteristics submitted of the antennas and the satellite network project and records it in the Master International Frequency Register. So this process must be completed within a maximum of 7 years to avoid unnecessary protection of projects not brought into use. And the satellite can be launched and operated with international recognitions. So for the other approach, the plan approach, the process consists of 3 main phases. So either the administration uses the plan parameters already coordinated and the satellite network will be notified and registered through a FACH procedures, or the administration will apply some modification to the parameters, and then the equivalent of a coordination phase is applied in which the Bureau examines the compatibility of the notice of the satellite network submitted in accordance with the radio regulations. Once the network is compatible, it is entering the so-called, in our jargon, list of assignments. Then it is a notification phase, similar to the non-plan approach, and the Bureau checks the detailed final characteristic. So the satellite can be launched and operated with international recognition. And in that case, the a priori plan remains completely protected. Chile is in ITU region 2. So the broadcasting satellite service plan for GSO is in bands 12, 17 gigahertz, and the fixed satellite service plan for GSO is in the band 6.4 gigahertz and 13, 10, 11 gigahertz. The provisions are available in the appendices 30, 30A, and 30B of the Book 2 of the radio regulation for application. And the BR software and online applications are assisting you to proceed with the filing of the examination of the satellite networks to ITU. Now let's talk more about this coordination process in practice. The ITU is known for ensuring the coordination use of space resources, so the spectrum, radio spectrum, and the orbits. However, as the number of satellite filing increases, it is recommended to plan carefully when to submit a filing within the regulatory deadlines to allow sufficient time for coordination with other operators. The ad hoc study and scaling of the satellite system is also essential to reduce technical changes and unnecessary coordination and to ensure compatibility of operation with other satellite systems. I would like also to talk about the concept of so-called first come, first served. it's not as definitive or black and white as it seems, thanks to the provisions added to allow operation to newcomers under conditions and to provide technical justification for existing systems. So existing systems cannot say simply no, they have to say no because for this and this technical reason, we cannot be compatible with the new system. So with this approach, which is more a filings date of reception approach, satellite system may not yet be in use during the coordination phase. And a speculative approach of future use is required. But with the application of provision 13.6, ensuring the monitoring of the actual use of satellites, there is no longer a paper satellite problem to manage as in the past, in the early 2000 years. This is good news to improve the coordination process. And indeed, we can remind that the radio regulations procedure is a balance in between the rights and obligations of both the incumbent administration and the new administration. So no administration obtains any particular priority as a result of being the first to start an ITU procedure. We have seen how to anticipate the risk of interference before the satellite is in operation. So now what happens if interference occurs during satellite operation? The regulation has provided for the provisions of Article 15 on interference infringement of the Constitution or radio regulations. So it states simply that all stations are forbidden to carry out unnecessary transmissions or the transmission of superfluous signals or the transmission of false or misleading signals in the transmission of signal without identification. So the station which is causing harmful interference should immediately eliminate this harmful interference. And this assumes a legal link between the transmitted station and the administration under the jurisdiction of which it is placed. That's where we come to the purpose of the national license, which is in Article 18 of the radio regulations. Conclude, let's look at the trends and challenges in the space sector for the radio regulations. During past years, the private investors and new technologies are allowing new needs and usage of spectrum and orbits. Today, we speak about preparing the third new space area. So, for example, the large constellations since 2015 and brought into use since 2019, the small satellites and the short duration missions developed by universities or startups giving access to space to new countries, and coming exploration of Moon, Mars, asteroids resources. Space is remaining glamorous and attractive to entrepreneurs and business. So ITU and the radio regulations may be challenged because those actors are not coming from the usual telecom world and national administrations. But the ITU and the radio regulations are evolving. And for example, the Plenipotentiary Conference in October 2022 adopted a new resolution about sustainability of the spectrum and associated orbit resources. It encourages more liaison with UN space entities like COPLOS and our friends UNOOSA organizing this event. And within this context, so ITU and the radio regulations remain essential and unique mechanism to prevent signal interference, to ensure a stable environment and equitable sharing of global natural resources. The key points to remember from this presentation are that radio frequency spectrum and associated orbits are two natural limited resources to be globally shared and regulated. That radio regulations constantly being improved to adapt to the needs of operators and the technologies. And next World Radio Communication Conference is in 17 days in Dubai, where we expect more than 7,000 delegates to make decisions by consensus and list in the WRC 2027, the next one, the agenda with new need of spectrum. So please do not hesitate to contact us at ITU if you have any questions. We will be happy, and we are always happy to assist you. So thank you.
Muchas gracias, Veronique, por tu presentación. Si existe alguna pregunta, dejo el micrófono abierto.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Rafael. I have a question about an equitable use of the orbits, because we are seeing that more and more satellites are being launched. So, for example, regarding for our country, I think you said that we have a number of a radio frequency available. So what if, for example, a new country appears? This country will have the same right. How the ITU regulates, for example, the quantity or the amount of each space, the space, for each country? That's the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Equitable access to space is definitely a key topic and a key concern. That's why it's one of the pillars of the radio regulations. And during all discussions, it's remained at the core of the concern of the delegates. For GSO access in BSS and FSS, we've got the plans, the space plans for since 2000. The latest replanning was in 2000 and in 2007 for the FSS. And that's really completely protecting the allocation to each of the member states. Now, for the low Earth orbit, so the constellation or the satellites orbiting the Earth, there's no planning approach. But however, there's this coordination approach. There's always a way to submit to ITU, identifying the need of coordination and processing through the coordination. It's not that easy, but it's never impossible. There's always possibility to find a way at operational level to find a way to cooperate within the orbit and the location. Not easy, I agree, but not impossible neither. Now, I haven't heard about any planning approach, which is not the most efficient way of using the spectrum. And last point I wanted to share is that we at ITU we speak about spectrum and signal compatibility and interference. We're not up to today. Maybe next month or in December at the end of the conference, the agenda item will say differently. But the number of objects, satellite objects on an orbit is not considered. As long as there's compatibility of signal without interference, there's compatibility of location of objects on low Earth orbits. That's why I hope I'm answering your questions.
Por el momento no hay más preguntas. Veronique, muchas gracias por tu presentación y por la asistencia a este taller nacional.
Okay, thank you.
A continuación, y para dar seguimiento al trabajo que se estuvo realizando durante la mañana, dejaré a Rosana Hoffman a cargo del ejercicio de escenarios. Muchas gracias.
So back to me. Thank you so much. I hope that the presentations you heard today were also of value to you. As you saw from the program, we started delving into the fundamentals of space law, delving into national space laws and regulatory aspects pertaining to national space law, continued with policy topics, but then also thought it paramount to share with you some areas of ITU regulation as we did today. And I believe a topic that might be of interest to Chile specifically in the near future, aspects of establishing a space agency, and not least also establishing a spaceport. So I hope that this combination of topics that we worked very hard with both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Air Force, and I'm looking at Ednan, who was really paramount in this regard to put together this program was of use to you. But these are no concluding remarks. It's more of a summary. Summary why? Because we're coming to the end of the experts sharing their expertise. It's now really up to you to finish the work on the discussion points. So you now have 1.5 hours before lunch. Hopefully lunch motivates you. The prospect of lunch motivates you, and you can now delve into discussion point 2, finish it. I would propose not to use more than 30 minutes to finish it, and then continue and finish discussion point 3. Because after lunch, you will see on the program, you only have 30 minutes to finish your presentation, and then you will present. So if you have any questions, please do feel free. We will let you work again, because I know often we come around, we try to help, but we are told, no, we need to work. So we will let you work. We are here, and in 10, 20 minutes, we go around and we see how you're doing. Okay, thank you so much. So maybe I wasn't clear. Group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I believe we also have. Please go together in your groups. And one more thing I would like to say, sorry about this, I forgot, because this question was asked a few times. You need to read all of the scenarios. You hear it or no? No translation? Do we have translation? Yes or no? Is what I'm being said translated? Yes? Okay, so I'll repeat. It is important for your for the work that you do now to read all 3 scenarios to be able to answer the questions. Discussion point 2 does not mean only scenario 2. Yes, I know it's confusing. In the future, we should probably change the approach. I apologize for this, but read all the scenario and try to answer the questions. Yes? Okay, thank you so much.